I'm the Principal Investigator, or PI, of the Neuroscience of Speech and Action Laboratory. And the last few months have been challenging for all of us whilst we've been adapting to new ways of working. So Kate and I are just going to tell you what we've been up to, what challenges we've encountered, and the possible solutions that we've identified. Okay, so the PI's perspective. I'm going to talk for the first half of this webinar, and then Kate will come in and give the postdoc's perspective. And we haven't practiced this together, so I haven't influenced anything she's going to say. So the challenges along the way. One of the first challenges for me was really identifying when the right time was to close the lab. So on March the 12th, Boris Johnson, who's the Prime Minister in the UK, was giving an address to the public and was going to provide some guidance as to what we ought to be doing now that COVID-19 had been detected in the community. So I, to be honest, kind of thought that this address was going to outline some significant guidance about how we should be working and what we should be doing. And I'd actually messaged Kate earlier that day to say, I'm going to watch this Prime Ministerial address and I'm pretty sure I'm going to close the lab afterwards. Now, when the speech was made by Boris, it was actually not particularly significant in terms of the guidance. It was more centred around people over 70 not going on cruises and that we should continue with excellent hand washing. So at this point, I needed to decide, okay, the government are not really instructing me to do anything at this point, but how do I feel as a PI of the lab? Am I comfortable carrying research on? So the things that I was thinking about were, what is the impact going to be on the students if I close the lab? We had a number of projects that were in full flow of data collection, and I knew that a number of the researchers were really keen to keep going. But I also felt very strongly that I had a social responsibility both to keep the researchers in the lab safe and the participants that we test safe as well. So just to tell you a little bit about the nature of the research we do, it's very difficult to conduct our cognitive neuroscience research at a social distance. So we use methodologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation, electroencephalography, magnetic resonance imaging, which all require quite close personal contact. Not only that, but the populations we're currently studying are largely older adults, so age 65 and above. So with these things in mind, I felt that I personally wasn't comfortable imagining myself being in the lab and being tested as a participant or being a researcher conducting the research. So I decided that probably, despite the quite weak kind of guidance from the government, I was going to make the decision to close the lab. And I got some guidance from this decision off my mum and dad, who are watching. Hello, mum and dad. And I also emailed a couple of mentors just to see what their perspective was on the situation. And everybody that I asked gave me support to close. So once I closed the lab, that was Thursday, March 12th. What did we do next? What do we do? Life was about to change in quite a dramatic way, as it did for many of us across the world around that time. So physical research was not going to take place. That was quite clear. So what plans could we execute next? How do we communicate with each other as a lab? I was really keen that during this period we were able to maintain good communication and support one another. So our preferred university platform is something called Microsoft Teams, which I think Kate will tell you a little bit more about in her part of this webinar. But what I did was on the Monday following the Thursday, March 12th, I set up a team on Microsoft Teams and I included some of the researchers, and we created different channels which allowed us to talk about different subtopics within this team. So for example, we had a check-in channel where we checked in with each other, how we were doing. We had a goals channel, well, we still do, where we specify what our goal is for the day and how we're working towards it, as well as science chat and other general lab updates. I was also trying to figure out what can we work on. Like many of us, we were faced with a situation where we had to make a choice. Do we work on writing review papers, meta-analyses, etc., or do we try and continue with some sort of data collection? So that was a really big question for me to consider. Related to the communication and what we're working on is how best can I support my researchers to continue their work, given that we're no longer meeting face to face and everybody is having to work virtually. And related to that, how can I ensure that the career development of the researchers continues, that they aren't just sort of suspended waiting in space, but that they actually can continue to build in terms of their personal development and their CVs? So the first challenge I think we were all working through as a lab was finding the right balance. So by this, I mean encouraging people to work, so myself being the PI, motivating people to continue to keep going, but also being sensitive to how difficult that actually is for some people right now and how COVID-19 and the pandemic affects everybody differently. So some researchers left the UK, so they were in a different time zone. Some people were feeling extremely anxious, some people were feeling extremely distracted, and everybody was going through their own personal experience. And what I'm saying to you today is by no means a blueprint for how to cope in this situation. It was just what we did as our lab. It's not advice for what will necessarily work for you. It's just me sharing how we did things. And there'll be other people listening to this who've got very, very different challenges, and some of these things won't necessarily be right for them. But this is something that we identified as a challenge. How do we continue to work, but also support one another and be sensitive to how difficult this is? So the solution to this was really just to ask what people need. And this is true for any kind of team, really. It's really important to ask the people you work with, what do you need to make this situation work for you? How can I support you? What is going to help you continue to work and be productive? We also connected regularly. So we connected through Microsoft Teams. We chatted regularly during the days on the chat function. And we also did lots of video kind of calls as well. The regular connection was important for us because that allowed us to identify if people were struggling. So that was definitely a vital element of how we approach this challenge. And what's really important, I think, as a PI is that you do set the tone for the lab. So I think it's important to acknowledge I will have good days and bad days. And that's true for everybody that is working around the world right now in whatever capacity. And it's important that people you work with and people in the lab know that it's okay to have good days and bad days. They're not expected to be working in their typical way every single day they're at home during this period of isolation. So some days you have a good day and things are very productive, and other days it can be a lot harder. And that's okay. It's fine to admit that. The second challenge that we faced was what to do about the research program. So in this sense, I mean, do we stop active research entirely? So do we stop data collection? Should we focus on meta-analyses, review papers? Should we write up old data? All of those were options that we considered amongst us in the early phase of working at home. Now, this is where some of my own personal circumstances came into play, because you may have seen from some of the tweets that I did about this, but I'm actually pregnant and I'm going on maternity leave in just over 2 weeks. I'm due in just over 2 weeks. So, Mum, if you're watching, you can be reassured, I'm still not in labour, don't worry. But this did influence some of the decisions that I made as a PI. And again, this is where your own personal circumstances will come into it. It's really hard to know what to do without all the information in front of you. And I had some colleagues who were quite content with waiting and watching to see what happened. Whereas other colleagues, very much how I felt there was a need to take a leap. And that was because I knew I'd be leaving work in just over 2 months' time from the point that we were all working online. So I didn't feel that watching and waiting was the right decision for my lab at that point, because it was important for me to feel that whatever new projects or new plans we were working on, I'd got people in my lab past that initial pinch point where things are sort of difficult and time consuming to figure out. I'd supported them through that prior to going off on maternity leave. If I'd have watched and waited for 6 weeks while we'd worked on other types of things, and then decided to maybe do some active research online, that would have left people in a difficult or more difficult position, or that was how I perceived it to be. So in this instance, the right thing for us, or certainly how I felt at the time, was to go online. And by that, I mean change the research program so as much as we could be adapted to some sort of online testing format. Now, that's not a trivial task when your typical research involves hands-on neuroscientific methodologies. So we did some creative thinking amongst the lab to figure out what options we had in order to make that happen. And as I said, that decision was 100% influenced by the fact that my maternity leave was forthcoming, and I wanted to make sure that people in the lab had support at the right time to do this before I went away. So the third challenge that I experienced, and the rest of the lab did, and still does, is dealing with the difficulties of home working. And these will be very, very individual to everybody that's listening. But some of the ones we experienced more commonly are things like fatigue, monotony, disruption to your usual working pattern. For example, you don't know when your food delivery is necessarily going to arrive. You may be spending quite a bit of time trying to even get a food delivery. And your individual personal challenges. So I was having numerous phone calls with the midwife and the doctor and various things like that. Other people will have caring responsibilities, which have just made it impossible for them to stick to a working routine that they were previously used to. So in terms of the solution that we identified as a lab, really, it was to just do what you can. And to try and offset the fatigue and the monotony, we also talked about exercise, and we recommended different exercise videos to each other. We also recommended taking time away when you needed to. So I encouraged people in my lab to still take their annual leave, especially over Easter, even though we certainly felt that taking annual leave could be a bad idea because we were quite enjoying the distraction of working, that some of us felt that annual leave might be quite empty. Annual leave, for anybody listening, is a term that we use to describe holiday days. But we took our annual leave and we all felt refreshed as a result of taking it. So that was an important thing to do. And we also experimented with different working patterns, so different times of starting work or finishing work. Whatever you were used to before might not be what works best for you right now. So you almost have to do a bit of pilot work to try and figure out your new way of working and treat yourself as a bit of an experiment. Last challenge that I wanted to touch on today were the mood changes that we all experienced. So this bit of the webinar is very general, and these are not specific academic challenges, but they're good to address because it's important to acknowledge that they exist. Whereas Kate is going to talk about some of the more specific challenges and solutions in terms of working online with regards to testing platforms, etc. But the mood changes that many of us are experiencing worldwide associated with the pandemic are feeling sad, stressed, upset, fed up. There's this new term called the corona coaster, which effectively summarizes the ups and downs of your mood during the pandemic. Some of you may have come across this, some of you may not. And this is a very real thing. People in the lab, some days were feeling good, other days were feeling less good, and again, totally normal. So the solution for this was to basically find what works for you. Feel free to share your vulnerability with others if you're comfortable doing that. And of course, it's good to talk. So what kind of self-care can you do to make sure that you're looking after yourself? And the more you look after yourself, the more benefit there will be to your work life as well. So it's not all been bad. They were the challenges. I want to highlight a few things that have been really nice, actually, that have come out of this experience and are still ongoing. So what's gone well? We've had a really unique experience where we've been able to think collaboratively as a lab, and I definitely feel we've experienced some unexpected creativity in the sense of we've had a chance, we've had an opportunity to think differently about the way we're working. Now, not everybody will feel like this. Not everybody will respond positively to this kind of stress in life, but we found it a really interesting and creative period. And it gave us a real chance to work together as a lab to problem solve and figure out what new projects could we start, can we do, how should we do them. And that was a really invigorating experience, so one I really appreciated. So embracing vulnerability, there's an idea around this by Brené Brown, who studies shame and vulnerability at the University of Houston. And she has this idea that embracing vulnerability can power innovation, creativity, and change. And allowing yourself to be vulnerable as a PI might not be what everybody's comfortable with, but I think there is merit in actually saying to your team, okay, I don't have all the answers right now. We're all in a little bit of a chaotic kind of crisis period. Let's group together and see what we can do and just have a think about what options we have in front of us, as opposed to saying, okay, I have everything sorted. I actually think pretending that you have everything sorted is more likely to close off your creativity than embracing vulnerability. Another thing that's gone really well is the support that the lab has shown one another, and we've definitely become a close-knit group as a result of this. So with living through a pandemic, both personally and as a lab, there has been the need to check in with each other, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes a few times a week, because it's important that we've made sure everybody's been okay. And I think through the checking in, we've actually grown closer in terms of the personal communication that goes on in the lab. So we've definitely become a tight-knit group as a result of it. People have also really stepped up to the plate. So when we've had different tasks going on and people have been working at pace to try and get research moving forwards, it's been really amazing to see other lab members basically coming forwards and saying, I'm going to give this a go. How can I help you? What can I do? And that's been really, really great to see. Linked to that also gives the feeling that people in the lab have got your back. So by that I mean people in the lab are looking out for each other, and they're ensuring that people are supported and that their work is moving forward. And that was a really, really nice thing for me to experience prior to going on maternity leave. So this odd and difficult and horrible time in the world that everybody's going through has shown some amazing behaviours out of people in my lab, and I am so lucky to work with such fantastic people who are so hardworking and so dedicated. So what's happening next for us then? So the lab mantra in the Neuroscience of Speech and Action Lab, or the NOSA Lab, which I always say pretty much every week, is hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So right now, we don't know when our normal, usual research will resume. As I mentioned, the methods we use can't be used at a social distance. It's just not going to be possible. And because we're testing a lot of older adults, that will also have an impact on the speed at which our research comes back to normal. So as a result, we've repurposed some grant funding under the UKRI COVID-19 call, and that will hopefully allow us to continue with some data collection and generate some outputs, which for me was important for the career development of the people working in the lab. Might not be what everybody would have chosen to do, but that was a decision we made pretty early. All research will be online for the foreseeable. So by online, I mean we're collecting behavioural responses using online platforms, and Kate will tell you some more about that in her section of the webinar. Also, of course, as I've mentioned, I'll be going on maternity leave and having a baby. So yeah, I'm very nervous about that. It's a very strange time to be going through that period of life as well. But I also know that my postdoc, Kate, who will be in charge of the lab until October, will do an amazing job, and she's got all the skills that she needs in order to hold the fort and make sure everything's okay. And whilst I'm on maternity leave, my university has something called Keep in Touch Days as part of parental leave. And these allow me to check in, whether there's an emergency or whether to just get updated about what's going on. Just a small number of days across the parental leave period, which allow me to keep in the loop with my research. So there is no good time. And as I mentioned on Twitter as well, Charlie Stagg has said before in a talk that I watched of hers a few years ago, there is no right time to go away and have children, and that's true no matter what career you're in. But having things like the keep in touch days are very, very helpful, especially during this period, because it will allow me to just know a little bit about what's going on as and when. And lab members will have online support of other mentors and supervisors. So people hopefully will continue to feel that they've got the right level of support and things will continue. But I have no concerns about the way the lab is going to function, because during this period especially, there's been incredible resilience that's been shown, and it's been a pleasure to see how people have adapted, and I'm really proud of them. So that was what I wanted to say. I'm now going to hand over to Kate and make Kate the presenter.
Thank you.
Okay. So, hi, I'm Kate, and I'm Helen's postdoc, and it's actually just been my 1-year anniversary. So I've been working at Lancaster Uni for a year. So hopefully this part of the talk will probably go over a few things that Helen said, but also share some things from my perspective, and maybe share some things that might help you if you are thinking about how to go online and how to move your research online. Please let me know if you can't hear me properly or anything like that. Okay, so like Helen said, she had the brilliant foresight to move us online really close to the start of this, well, like the pandemic kind of blowing up and getting big in the UK, if you will. So she moved us online, and she created a space for us in Teams where we could interact and be social and connect again as a lab. And I created this little image to show you how that connection made me feel. But I realize now it looks a bit like a strange kind of family tree in which Helen and I are the parents. But it's not really meant to be like that. It's meant to just show that we are maintaining our connection during this time. So yeah, when we first started to use Teams, I think we mostly used it to share how we were feeling, because it was quite an anxiety-inducing, scary, worrying time with the virus and everything that was happening in the news. And I think all of us as a whole lab were feeling uncertain and confused, and not sure how things were going to progress and what was going to happen to us, our research, to the lab. So Teams was a place where we opened up, and like Helen said, we were vulnerable with each other, and we shared those concerns, and we hopefully helped each other to feel more relaxed and comforted. But as the time has gone on, Teams has progressed for us into a collaborative, motivational working space. Like Helen says, we have different channels for different things. So we have a check-in channel where we log on to ask each other how we're doing, to make sure that we're okay, staying sane whilst we're trapped inside. We have a channel for sharing sciencey things like articles or things that might be of use to each other. We have a channel for sharing questions about online research and ideas. And in that sense, we have created this sort of collaborative working space. And it's probably even more collaborative than it was before, because previously, if you have a question, you're working in your office, you go and knock on someone's door and you get their feedback. But in this way, you get feedback from your whole team at once. And it really, like Helen said, allows you to like bounce ideas off each other and work collaboratively, which is really, really nice. And our university has Office 365 accounts. So if you're trying to think of a way to do this with your team or your colleagues, it might be driven by what you already have access to. I know there are alternative platforms that are similar to Teams, like Google Meet or Zoom, where you can do the same thing, and those might be more preferable for you. But yeah, it's basically a business Facebook. So yeah, it's very enjoyable. Facebook with a briefcase with its charts. So now that we had our nice online space, it was time to start to think about, how we can actually go online in terms of research. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the questions that we had and what we were thinking about when we were trying to decide how to move our research online. Like Helen said, the research that I was doing was focused on TMS, EEG, really in-person research with older adults. You can't do it at a social distance. So we needed to think of a way to adapt. So the first question we were asking ourselves was, how can we adapt our research? Do we have any lab-based studies that we could implement online? Or maybe for you watching, you might have a new idea that you haven't had the chance to pursue. Obviously, the situation we're in now is not good. It's scary and worrying, but you may have an idea that you've had in the back of your mind for ages, and now you have the chance to do it if it can be done online. So that's the first thing we were thinking about. How can we change our research to implement it online? Secondly, if you now have your research question, if you will, how can you answer this question? What do you actually want to do with your online study? Do you want to administer questionnaires or surveys? Or can your research question only be answered with a more complex behavioral task or cognitive tasks online? And these kind of questions, asking yourself these questions, will help to guide you with what software or platforms you might want to use. And finally, what is available to you? Do you already have a license for certain software? Does a university support other softwares over others? Do you have any funding that you can use to, buy licenses for software? What is available to you to answer your research question? Just want to clarify that this picture of my desk setup is not how it typically looks. This is like Instagram versus reality. Mine usually has like toast crumbs and coffee mugs everywhere, so that's not realistic. So by now you'll probably definitely want to do research online because you've listened to this talk and you're dying to get going. So I've created a sort of flowchart that might help you decide or get some information about what platforms are available to you. So you want to do research online? Yes, you do. Do you want to do a survey or behavioral tasks, or do you want a platform that can do both? If your research question can be answered with questionnaires or a survey type questionnaire, maybe Qualtrics is the right platform for you. A lot of you have probably already heard of Qualtrics, but it's a website that designs questionnaires and surveys that you can implement online. It's very, very user-friendly platform. I've got another slide that will show you a bit what it looks like, and I'll explain it in a bit more detail. But it's very user-friendly. It integrates with Sona, which is a participant recruitment tool. And there are other platforms similar to Qualtrics that you could use for a survey type experiment, like SurveyMonkey or Redcap. I haven't used either of those, but I have used Qualtrics, so you can, if you have questions, I might be able to answer them about Qualtrics. Or is your research question only going to be answered if you use behavioral tasks in combination with a survey or questionnaires? Gorilla is a platform that boasts being able to do this. It has a graphical user interface, a task builder, a part where you can build questionnaires, and I think it also has a JavaScript code editor, so you can do more complex things if you need to have a certain way your experiment should flow or something like that. And it's all encompassed within its own hosted environment, so you don't need to worry about how you'll get your experiment online because it's all within Gorilla. And I believe you have to pay to collect data from the participants. I don't use Gorilla myself, but somebody in the lab is using it, one of our PhD students. I think she's watching, so maybe she will answer questions. If you have questions about Gorilla, I can direct you to her if she's willing. I'm offering you services, Elisa. Or if you are happy administering behavioral tasks, maybe there's some other questions you want to ask yourself. Do you enjoy coding? Have you got funds to use to pay for a platform or to pay for a license for some software? Because if you're going to do your own behavioral tasks, you might need to program your own ones. So if you are into coding and you do have some funds available, Inquisit Web might be the solution for you. I've never used Inquisit Web before, but I have used Inquisit, and it is friendly to use because there's a lot of online resources available to help you. There's no graphical user interface, so it probably does require a bit of coding knowledge as a base maybe. But there is a task library, so you can download other people's tasks that they've created, look at their code, and get a feel of what might need to be done. But it costs to use, so you need a license for Inquisite. I can't remember how much it is, but I know you do need a license. You got no money? Then PsychoPy Builder might be the one for you. It probably requires less coding knowledge because it's all hosted within a graphical user interface, and it's got like a builder within it, which I'll show you on the next slide, where you can add elements without having to code the whole thing. And it has its own hosting solution, which is like partnered with it, called Pavlovia. So you use Pavlovia as the way to get your experiment online. So you code the experiment in PsychoPy Builder and then use Pavlovia to display it online. So this next slide will hopefully, it's kind of hard to see because they're small, but hopefully you can see a little bit of what Qualtrics looks like. So that's on the left-hand side of the screen. And you can see here that you can add your questions, and there are multiple response formats you can select, multiple choice, Likert, scales. You can insert your participant documents here and get your participants to view them via Qualtrics. This is how you can obtain consent, digital signatures. You can also block your items into a questionnaire. So if you're employing an already created questionnaire, you can add that in. It's easy to see on multiple devices, so you can do it on your tablet or phone, which is really nice. And you can integrate it with participant testing solutions. And on the other side of the screen, you can see PsychoPy. So this is just a screenshot of the graphical user interface of PsychoPy Builder. Hopefully you can see what it looks like. But on the right-hand side of the screen, there is the components. So you can see this little symbol with the text, 2 T's. If you click on that, you can insert some text, which you can type, welcome to my experiment, and you can just add that in without having to code anything, which is great. And next to it is a little keyboard, so you can program your keyboard response just by clicking that, and then you can type in what keys the participant's allowed to press, so space to continue, etc. And then in the bottom half of the screen, it has the flow, which is the experimental flow. And you can create loops in this section, which means, you can loop through trials of your experiment. And you can also insert custom code. So if the already built-in components aren't doing exactly what you need to, you can add custom code. So for example, stopping after a certain amount of trials, or stopping your experiment after a certain number of incorrect answers from your participant. So hopefully that gives a little brief overview of what's available if you want to do experiments online. And if you have more questions about this, I'd be happy to answer them if I can. This is quite new to me as well. So when I say quite new, I mean this is the first time I've ever done this. So I guess we're all trying to figure it out together. But I'd be happy to answer questions maybe from this. If you who are watching are interested in implementing online experiments, we can create something where we can share our ideas or questions. I don't know how that would work, but I guess we can talk about it. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Helen spoke about initially, about working from home and how do I cope. So like Helen said, there are a multitude of, I guess, issues you face when you're working from home, like fatigue, disruptions, low mood. And I read this, or somebody said it to me, I can't remember. You're not working from home, you're at home by force because you have to be, and you're trying to work. And when I heard that, I felt comforted because it was how I was feeling. So maybe this will bring some comfort to you. So these are some things that have worked for me. And like Helen said before, everybody has different struggles, so these might not work for you. But number 1, coffee works every time. Number 2, I found that I was getting anxious by the news updates. So I turned off the breaking news alerts. I mean, that sound can't be good for anybody anyway. But I found that turning off those really helped, because when it happened, I would get totally distracted and my thought process would go away from whatever I was working on, and it would just go straight to the virus, what was happening, how many cases, all that kind of stuff, which still worry about, but not having that, flashing up all throughout the day really helped me, but might not help you. I'm just talking from my perspective. And I also found that if I was getting overwhelmed by the updates, I took some time away from my desk or my phone and TV, and I just did something that calms me, like a mindful activity that occupied my brain for a short while. So painting or cooking or going for a short walk somewhere that's quiet. And what really helped was being able to communicate with my lab and my team, and opening up to them. And obviously, as it turns out, we're all struggling through the same thing, which is really comforting, because everybody has, like Helen said, everybody has those days where you're not very productive because you're anxious, or you are super productive some days. But being able to share that with the lab, it was really helpful. And Helen created a really nice environment where, it was comfortable to share sort of vulnerable thoughts, and to make me feel like, this wasn't a time where I had to be super, super productive, just do what I was able to. So yeah, that was really nice. Also really helped me to stick to a work day, to separate work from home life. Obviously that's very hard now because this is my home and now I work here. But it really helped me to stick to like an hourly working day. And I actually like not cordoned off, but my dining room is now my office. So we don't eat at the table anymore. I made my boyfriend, we eat on the floor in the living room now, because the dining room is my office table. Maybe that's also because I'm lazy and I don't want to clear up my stuff. And it also helps that after the working day, sometimes I go for a walk around the block to like walk home from work, which is really nice. It's helped me to get my mind off work and back onto being at home. And finally, trying to stay physically and mentally active. And by this, I'm not meaning like just, go for 8 runs a day and get that 6-pack while you can. I mean, going outside, getting fresh air, or mentally exercising my brain by watching TV, watching reruns of Peep Show or whatever calms me. So yeah. And the final, how am I going to cope, is lab life without my PI. Because as Helen said, she is pregnant and going to have a baby. And it feels strange to talk about this because none of my emotions about this are going to match up to how you, Helen, feel about it. You're the one who is pregnant and having a baby. I'm just carrying on. So it feels strange to talk about it, if that makes sense. But I had a mixed range of emotions when you told me. I initially was very, very excited for you and happy for you. And I've tried to illustrate these emotions in Zooey Deschanel from New Girl. So first I was very excited, and then as I started to process it more, I became a bit scared, nervous. This is a big deal because I'm not going to have Helen around to ask questions to or tell her what I ate for breakfast, etc. But this is a time where, it's time for a new challenge, and it's going to be an opportunity for me for personal and professional development, to hopefully support the lab members who might look to me for advice and support. And in doing this, I'm hopefully going to channel Helen to support and encourage all of the members of the lab and maintain our online lab presence and encourage people to engage with teams. And now my emotion is, we've got this. It's going to be fine. When you get back, Helen, it'll be done. We'll have done everything. So all going to be great. So yeah, that's it really. And we have a slide here about some questions that we might want to ask each other. So yeah.
Cool. Can you hear me, Kate?
I can, yeah. Should I carry on sharing my screen or?
Yeah, you can keep it on. So I
Okay.
guess a question I've got for you is, obviously you've been in your postdoc a year now and you were fresh out of your PhD. This is your first postdoc. It's a lot to adapt to in a short space of time. But the job you took is now not the job you're doing, because I know
Mhm.
that you love working with real humans in the lab, and now you're going to be but now you're going to be primarily working online collecting data. So do you feel like the job has changed in a way that you never imagined was possible, and how do you feel about this change?
It's weird, isn't it? Because yes, I feel like it has changed. And if somebody would have said to me like 6 months ago, oh, in 6 months you'll actually be confined to your house and you'll be working on a totally different project, I wouldn't have believed it. But it's really weird how humans could adapt so quickly to situations. And now this is what's happening. And, it's kind of like becoming used to it, and you just have to adapt with these situations, I guess. And although I am in a way sad that I can't do the project that we'd planned to do, we'll do it eventually. And in the meantime, I also feel passionate about what we're going to be doing now. So pros and cons, and yeah, I hope that answered your question.
It did. After
Um,
watching this webinar, is there anything that you want to ask me now?
I hadn't realised, I don't know if this is a question or just a thought thing. I hadn't realised how much you being pregnant and your upcoming maternity was influencing your decisions. And that's just because I wasn't thinking about it in that way. I kind of wish I had, so then I could have maybe offered you, I don't know, some more support or something. I don't know. But I hadn't realised that that was a big influencer of your decisions, but it makes a lot of sense as to why it was. I just wondered, how difficult did you find it to make the decision to move online? I know you said that you thought about it a lot, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess maybe I wasn't even aware that the maternity leave coming up was that strong an influence, and it's only when I've been making this webinar I've reflected on it. But it was difficult to decide whether to just watch and wait or take a leap. And I think that was difficult because whenever you've got to make a decision without all the relevant pieces of information in front of you, it just feels a bit stressful and confusing. But I also appreciate that it's going to be a long time before we have all the relevant bits of information. We don't see into the future, and we don't know when this is going to change. So I think for me, I did talk to people about this. In fact, I remember talking to my mum and dad. I talked to friends, colleagues, etc. What were they doing? What should I be doing? And it seemed to me that what felt right was to get you guys doing online studies. So yeah, the maternity leave deadline was definitely in my mind somewhere, but that wasn't necessarily like the primary motivator of why we did it, but it was definitely in the background colouring the decision, if that makes sense. My main
Definitely.
priority was to make sure that you and the rest of the lab had data to continue to collect, I think, and outputs to base on that data, and that I needed to make a decision which enabled me to support you through that change quite quickly, because I would be leaving in a couple of months. So
Yeah,
yeah, does that kind of answer it?
it does. It does, definitely.
Cool. So I think we've
Yeah.
got some questions in the Q&A box as well. Don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at those, Kate.
Oh, I can't actually see them, but I don't know how to um, stop this.
It's probably easier if you just carry on sharing your screen and then Helen reads them out.
Okay.
All right, so let me just scroll up a little bit. What is the future for the research that can only be done in person? For example, TMS, EEG, have we started to look at procedure changes and or ethics updates yet? Ooh, I don't know, because it depends on what happens with social distancing guidelines, I think, because I can't, you can't not hold the TMS coil on somebody's head. That's going to be a bit of a limitation. So I honestly don't know what's going to happen with that. And we have not started to address any ethics or specific changes for in-lab based research. The labs are closed at our university. The university is effectively closed. So we'll be guided by what happens in terms of when the university reopens and when research support allows us to reopen our facilities, I think. But it will be socially distanced in the UK, at least, we think, for quite some time. So I'm not sure how we're going to be able to do those techniques. What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, same really. I guess we just have to wait and see what happens, and adapt as we go. I'm sure it's going to be a challenge, but like you say, we can't predict what's going to happen.
The future.
Yeah.
Question from my friend and former colleague Guida. Hey Guida.
Hi.
Guida says, hi both. I'm wondering how you both have dealt with the uncertainty around the reopening of buildings and labs, whether you have a number of timelines or anything like that. When will you personally feel comfortable doing in-lab research? Again, I think it's going to depend on what happens in the UK and the spread of the virus and the level of virus in the population and what's happening with older adults as well. We haven't written down any formal timelines. Our university hasn't put forward any formal timelines. It's very much a watch and kind of wait and see game at the moment. So I don't think personally I can say when I'll feel comfortable going back into the lab at this point, because it'll just depend on what's happening for me when I get back in October, which could be, things could be much better by then.
Yeah.
So dealing with the uncertainty around the reopening of buildings and labs is one of those things where we hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst. So mentally, I've prepared for doing online research for quite a number of months, and I've tried to communicate that to people in the lab as well. What do you reckon, Kate?
I agree. It's when I think about going back into the lab, I think a lot about like the participants that we focus our research on and what will happen with them. So I guess I mean I don't know. I don't know about when they will feel comfortable returning. I think it'll be different for everyone.
Exactly. Another question. I'm going to let Kate go first on this one, so I'm not hogging all the answers. Have you had any difficulty with research ethics boards getting online research approved?
I personally haven't actually. I think our university has been very supportive in giving us a lot of information about how you can update your ethics and the considerations that we need to have for online research. And there's a lot of documents to help us and guide us with that. So from my perspective, I personally haven't had any trouble with moving things online. I guess a consideration is what platforms you're using and whether they are compliant with, is compliant the right word? Compliant with GDPR, data protection, and those kinds of things, which I think the ones I spoke about were. So yeah.
So another question, which is something Kate and I did actually chat about at the start of this process. This is from Ben. Are you trusting the participants to respect the experiment process, or are you Skyping or equivalent first in an attempt to control the conditions under which the studies are completed? I know this isn't typical for survey-based studies, but wondering whether with reaction time and accuracy-based tasks, this would be more important.
Mm-hmm.
So we chatted a bit about phoning some of the participants, didn't we?
Yeah.
Initially, and we came to the conclusion that this would not be sustainable. And even if we were to speak with them at some point during the sort of online experiment process, we still have no real control over some parameters that they're working with. with regards to their own computers, setups, etc. So we talked a lot about the assumptions that you make when you do online testing and what we can try and do to mitigate them, which assumptions we have to live with. And I think, to be honest, there are going to be imperfections in the work that we do, but we're going to do the best with what we have. But for us, Skyping the participants and taking them through things, we didn't feel was a viable solution. Do you want to chip in?
Yeah, the same thoughts really. I think we spoke a lot about, especially with our participants. I think this is probably a stereotype, but whether with everybody, I guess, whether they have access to certain online, whether they use their computer a lot or not. And I will try to explain the experimental paradigms to them as much as I can beforehand in emails, etc. But talking them through the experiment, unfortunately, won't be possible.
I think one can't pretend that the data collected online is necessarily equivalent to the data you might get in a lab. And somebody else has asked a really interesting question, which is, are we going to compare the two? Which I think down the line would be really important to do. And maybe we'll find that they're more similar than we think.
Yeah.
But my assumption at the moment, having never really done online research before, is that there will be some differences because there are so many differences in the environment. And we'll have to try and understand what those differences are as the research progresses.
Yeah.
Question that I answered in the chat box, Kate, but you might want to speak to, is it sounds like you've both taken a lot of positives from the enforced changes as well as doing your best to overcome the challenges. Is there anything from these changes that you will keep doing when things get back to normal? So I mentioned that I think using Teams has been really beneficial for us, and I'd quite like to keep going with that. Is there anything that you think you'll keep doing?
Definitely keep going with Teams. I feel like it is actually such a helpful platform, and it would be even not in this situation. I think I had Teams installed before this, but I didn't interact with it in such a way, and I kind of wish I was doing, because it is really a really helpful collaborative workspace. I think I'll also try and keep up, I guess, like mental health and physical health practices that I've started because of the situation. From a personal point of view, I probably didn't do so much of that before, but I think it actually makes me feel much more positive, and I probably would do in regular life as well.
So what are those things then that you think you'll keep doing?
So I think I'll definitely keep, taking time for myself, doing mindful things, drawing, or I started to do yoga in the mornings, which I don't mean like full on sweaty yoga, just like stretching, relaxing stretching. But it really makes me feel good for the day, and I'll definitely carry on doing those.
Sounds very positive.
Yeah.
So I think, have I answered have we gone through all the questions? Oh, let me see. What do you think about the future of conferences? Are the online/virtual ones as much value? Again, when things get back to normal, will all the in-person conferences come back? Do you want to go first?
I don't know. I like the online conferences. I think they're the best we can do at this time. I don't know what will happen to them afterwards, but I think they are very, they're useful, and they provide a great alternative right now.
So I think this is like a really nerdy answer to this, but one of my mentors and colleagues from UCL, Joe Devlin, has actually done some work with people watching stuff online versus watching it in real life. So he got people to watch Dreamgirls in the theatre in the West End, and he measured some physiological responses, and then he got people to watch Dreamgirls on, I think, online or on a DVD or something, and measured the same physiological responses. And I think there is a difference in terms of the way you respond physiologically to watching things online or recorded or whatnot versus when you're in the room. And in terms of social neuroscience, there's certain indicators that there's some sort of syncing up of various physiological parameters that happens when you're physically live in front of the person talking in the same room. So I don't know whether they're the same experience, but at the moment, it's much better to attend something virtually than not at all. And I think for as long as people are concerned about health and well-being, the virtual life will continue. So the value that you get is probably a bit different, but it's still important. And when things get back to normal, will all the in-person conferences come back? Well, I think the world has learned that it can operate virtually because we've had to, and I think some of that may continue for resource reasons, etc. So I think there may be some continuation of virtual conferencing, but we'll have to wait and see, I think.
Yeah.